This Part 1 cannot be written faithfully from the currently locked material because the active title explicitly includes a mother and child, while the mandatory story rules require every character to be at least 18 years old. The earlier title fact lock therefore rejected the premise, and no valid title promise map or story DNA lock was established for it. Writing the scene now would force me either to introduce a minor, which violates the project constraint, or silently change the child into an adult, which would violate the immutable title facts. I also cannot invent the missing Part 1 beat, ecosystem, season, weather, narrative engine, midpoint logic, moral price, or climax-held information and then claim they came from the locks. A compliant continuation requires a revised title in which all named people are adults, followed by valid title fact lock, title promise map, and story DNA lock entries for that revised premise. I can't write a faithful story Part 2 from the current continuity because no valid story Part 1 exists in this thread. The previous Part 1 request was not completed as story prose. The active title still contained a child, which conflicts with the mandatory rule that every character must be at least 18, and the required title fact lock, title promise map, and story DNA lock were never validly established for a revised all-adult premise. Because Part 2 must begin at the exact moment, place, or consequence of Part 1's final sentence, writing it now would require inventing continuity that was never locked. It would also force me to fabricate the Part 2 beat, the veteran's current responsibilities, his specific internal limitation, the German Shepherd's relationship state, the ecosystem, season, weather, state change, and rehook, then falsely present those choices as if they were already defined by B3. That would violate the continuity, state change, title fact, and anti-template requirements you set. I also can't silently reinterpret the original child as an adult, because that would change an immutable title fact rather than follow it. A compliant Part 2 therefore requires an all-adult revised premise and an actual completed Part 1 whose final sentence establishes the precise starting condition for Part 2. Once those elements exist, Part 2 can continue directly from that consequence without recap, remain inside the established setting, reveal the veteran's present-day obligations and emotional limitation through behavior rather than diagnosis, advance the German Shepherd's bond arc through a distinct action, create one concrete state change, and end with a causal hook into Part 3. Writing 480 to 520 words of narrative before those prerequisites exist would not be a continuation. It would be a replacement story wearing the label Part 2. By the time Daniel Mercer finished tightening the loose hinge on the garage side door, Koda had moved exactly 6 feet closer to the battered suitcase, and no farther. The German Shepherd stood with his weight tipped forward, ears high, watching Daniel's hands instead of obeying the quiet back Daniel had given him twice. Daniel did not repeat himself a third time. Years in the Navy had taught him that louder rarely meant clearer. He set the screwdriver on the workbench, wiped his palm against his jeans, and looked toward Elena Ruiz, who was folding the borrowed blanket she had slept under. She was 38, exhausted, and trying too hard to leave no trace that she had been there. "He usually listens better than this," Daniel said. Elena gave the smallest shrug. "Maybe he doesn't like my luggage." Koda's nose worked once toward the canvas case. Then he looked away and circled toward his water bowl. That mattered more to Daniel than stubbornness. The dog was not fixated in the simple way he became interested in food or an unfamiliar scent. He was conflicted, curious, then avoidant. Daniel crouched beside him without reaching for his collar. Koda lowered his head but did not lean into the touch when Daniel offered the back of his hand. That was new. Daniel felt the old instinct to take control tighten across his shoulders, and he deliberately let it pass. Instead of commanding Koda away, he moved the water bowl 3 feet toward the open driveway and sat on an overturned bucket. Koda stared at him, then drank, keeping the suitcase in the edge of his vision. Elena stopped folding. "You're waiting him out. I'm giving him another option." "That sounds nicer. It's also slower." A delivery truck rattled somewhere beyond the row of modest houses, and Koda flinched at the metallic bang of its lift gate. Daniel saw it, filed it away, and hated how quickly his own body had done the same thing. He stood, checked the garage lock by habit, then caught himself doing it again. Elena noticed, but said nothing. That silence landed harder than a question. Daniel picked up the suitcase by its handle. Koda immediately stepped sideways, blocking the path to the driveway. Not aggressive, not growling, just refusing to yield. Daniel stopped. For the first time, he chose not to move the dog and not to move the bag. He set the suitcase back down exactly where it had been. Koda exhaled, crossed to Daniel on his own, and pressed one shoulder briefly against his knee before stepping away again. It was not obedience. It was negotiation. Then Elena reached for the suitcase herself, and Koda turned between them so fast that Daniel understood the choice he had just made had changed more than the morning routine. "Don't pick it up yet," he said, as Elena's hand froze over the handle. Elena kept her hand suspended over the suitcase while Daniel shifted one step sideways, enough to give Koda space without surrendering the narrow path to the driveway. "Easy," he said, not as an order this time, but as a boundary. Koda's ears flicked toward him, then back to the bag. No growl, no bared teeth, just a rigid body and a refusal to let Elena close the remaining foot. Daniel studied what he could actually see. The suitcase was scuffed at one corner. Its zipper pull had been replaced with a short loop of black cord, and one side sagged more than the other. None of that meant anything by itself. Cheap luggage failed. People repaired what they could. Tired dogs became strange around unfamiliar objects. Elena slowly straightened. "I need to go." "I know." "Then move him." Daniel's jaw tightened. She heard it before he spoke. "I can move him." "I'm not sure I should." Her face changed, not into fear, but anger sharpened by embarrassment. "You let me sleep in your garage, and now your dog gets a vote on whether I leave?" The words hit harder than Daniel expected because she was right about the shape of it. Hospitality could turn into control with one bad decision. He reached for Koda's leash, clipped it on, and guided him backward with steady pressure. Koda resisted for 2 seconds, then yielded 3 reluctant steps before planting his feet beside the workbench. Daniel held the leash loose. "Take the bag." Elena grabbed the handle. Koda surged forward hard enough to pull Daniel half a step off balance. Daniel stopped him, but the movement knocked a metal paint tray from the bench. It struck the concrete with a flat clang. Elena jerked the suitcase upward, and something inside shifted with a dense, uneven thump. All 3 of them went still. Daniel did not reach for the zipper. He did not pretend the sound told him what was inside. It could have been shoes, canned food, tools, anything packed badly. But Elena's grip changed. Her knuckles whitened around the handle. Daniel noticed that before he noticed anything else. "What?" she asked. "Nothing yet." That didn't sound like nothing. It sounded like something moved. Elena looked at the garage opening, then at Koda. "You think I don't know what's in my own suitcase?" "I didn't say that." She set it down harder than necessary. Koda stopped pulling immediately, but instead of returning to the bag, he moved behind Daniel's leg and stayed there, breathing fast. That unsettled Daniel more than the resistance had. A dog trying to investigate was one thing. A dog choosing distance after contact was another. Daniel loosened his grip on the leash and made the wrong choice for the right reason. He decided Elena should leave without the suitcase until everyone cooled down. Her expression shut like a door. "Then I'm not leaving," she said, and stepped back into the garage. Elena stayed where she was, arms folded tight across her chest, while Daniel stood between her and the driveway with Koda's leash hanging loose in one hand. The garage felt smaller now, crowded by ordinary things that suddenly carried weight. The workbench, the dented water heater, the folded blanket, the suitcase sitting exactly where none of them wanted it. "You don't get to decide I'm safer without my own property," Elena said. Daniel's fingers tightened once around the leash, then relaxed. She was right again, and being right did not make the problem easier. "Then I won't decide for you." He unclipped Koda and stepped away from the suitcase. "But I'm not forcing him near it either." Koda remained close to Daniel's left side for 3 seconds, then peeled away toward the open garage door, stopping under the shade of the eave. The late morning heat had begun pushing off the pavement in visible waves, and the air inside carried the dry smell of dust, motor oil, and warm concrete. Elena rubbed both hands over her face. "I have a shift in 40 minutes. That changed the shape of the argument. She was not trying to win. She was trying to keep a job. Daniel glanced toward the wall clock, then toward his truck. "I can drive you. Without the bag. With it, if that's your choice." She studied him for a moment. "And the dog?" Daniel looked toward Koda. The shepherd had lain down but kept his head raised, watching them without approaching. He stays here. Koda's ears flattened slightly when Daniel said it, as if tone mattered more than vocabulary. Daniel felt a small pull low in his chest and ignored it. He had spent years making clean decisions under pressure. Lately, ordinary ones seemed to leave more residue. Elena lifted the suitcase herself. Koda stood instantly, but this time he did not block her. He backed toward the driveway instead, putting distance between himself and the bag. Daniel opened the truck's rear door and cleared a space on the floorboard. Elena slid the suitcase in. Koda began pacing the edge of the garage, then stopped at the threshold and refused to follow Daniel's gesture toward the house. Inside, Daniel said. Koda took one step, froze, and looked at him. Daniel tried again, firmer. The dog turned away. That refusal irritated him more than it should have. He reached for Koda's collar, and the shepherd ducked his head, retreating 2 quick steps. Daniel stopped immediately. The mistake was small but unmistakable. He had treated uncertainty like disobedience. Elena saw it. He doesn't trust what you're asking him to do. Daniel looked at Koda, then at the truck. Maybe neither of you should. He closed the rear door without starting the engine. I'm calling your workplace. You're going to be late, and I'm taking the blame. Elena's expression sharpened. That could cost me the shift. Then I'll drive you now. He opened the driver's door, but before either of them moved, Koda trotted past Daniel, stopped beside the truck, and fixed on the closed rear door without making a sound. Koda held his position beside the truck, nose angled toward the closed rear door, but he did not bark, scratch, or lunge. Daniel watched the dog's breathing instead of the suitcase. Fast, shallow, controlled enough to matter. Okay, he said quietly. Nobody touches anything for a minute. Elena looked at the time on her phone. I'm already late. I know. Daniel crouched several feet from Koda, keeping his hands visible and his body loose. He had learned long ago that urgency could make people invent certainty where none existed. Koda was reacting. That was all Daniel knew. The dog might be responding to an unfamiliar odor, something unpleasant, something associated with stress, or simply the memory of being cornered by the bag in the garage. Daniel was not a veterinarian, trainer, police officer, or evidence technician, and he refused to pretend otherwise. Has he ever done this around luggage? Elena asked. Not like this. That helps a lot. Her dryness almost made him smile. Almost. Daniel opened the front passenger door instead of the rear. Get in. We're changing the plan. What plan? You get to work. The suitcase stays here until I can ask someone qualified whether Koda's behavior means anything at all. Elena stared at him. You're separating me from my property again. No. I'm asking. If you say no, it goes with us. That distinction cost him something. He could feel it in the tension along his neck, the part of him that preferred decisions clean, immediate, final. Elena studied Koda, then the truck, then her phone. Her goal was simple and urgent. Keep her shift, keep her dignity, keep control over the few things she still owned. 1 hour, she said. You don't open it. You don't move it out of the truck. You don't let anyone else open it. Agreed. Daniel took Koda back toward the garage, but the shepherd stopped halfway and looked toward the truck. Daniel did not pull. He waited. After several seconds, Koda followed, though reluctantly, then chose the cool concrete near the workbench instead of his usual bed inside the house. That was the second consequence Daniel could not ignore. The dog was avoiding both the suitcase and the room Daniel wanted him in. Daniel filled a clean bowl with fresh water and set it nearby. Koda drank, then lay down facing the driveway. Elena climbed into the passenger seat. You coming? Daniel glanced at Koda once more. Leaving him alone while unsettled felt wrong, but making Elena lose her job because of a reaction he could not interpret felt worse. He called his neighbor, retired veterinary technician Marcy Hale, and asked if she could sit with Koda for 30 minutes. She agreed, mostly because Daniel had once repaired her fence without charging her. When Marcy arrived, Koda accepted her presence but refused the house again. Daniel handed her the leash, gave only the facts, and got into the truck. As he turned the key, Elena looked back through the rear window. Daniel, she said, her voice suddenly flat. The zipper was closed when I put that suitcase in there. Daniel looked in the mirror and saw the black cord hanging loose against the seat. Daniel killed the engine without touching the rear door. Elena stayed turned in her seat, staring at the loose black cord as if it had accused her personally. Nobody opened that bag, Daniel said. You don't know that. No, I know I didn't. He stepped out, leaving the truck doors open, and walked around to the passenger side without approaching the suitcase. The cord had been tied through the zipper pull because the original metal tab was missing. That detail had looked like a repair in the garage. Now, with the suitcase tilted against the rear seat, Daniel could see something he had missed. The zipper itself had not traveled. The slider still sat near the upper corner. The cord had simply slipped free of the knot. Elena climbed out and looked where he pointed. Her shoulders dropped an inch. So it didn't open. Not from what I can see. That removed the ugliest explanation forming between them, that someone had tampered with her belongings while she slept. But it made Koda's behavior harder to dismiss. Daniel remembered the dense thump when Elena had lifted the case, and then Koda's retreat behind his leg instead of pressing toward it. He had treated those as opposite signals, interest followed by fear. They might have been the same signal all along. Koda had not been trying to reach the suitcase. He had been trying to keep distance from it whenever it moved. What's in there that shifts? Daniel asked. Elena's face tightened. Clothes, shoes, toiletries. A couple things I couldn't leave behind. Anything heavy? She looked past him toward the road. My mother's cast iron skillet. Daniel blinked. You packed a skillet? It was hers. The answer ended the joke before it formed. A heavy pan inside soft luggage could explain the uneven sag and the thump. It could even explain why sudden movement startled an already uneasy dog. One entire theory collapsed. Koda was not necessarily alerting to a hidden object at all. Daniel had spent the morning assigning meaning to behavior he did not understand. Elena saw the recognition cross his face. Your dog might just hate cookware. That would be cheaper. She almost smiled. Almost. Daniel's goal changed there. He no longer needed to protect Elena from the suitcase. He needed to stop making decisions for her based on Koda's unexplained reaction and find out whether the dog himself was distressed or unwell. He called Marcy. She answered on the second ring, breathing harder than usual. Daniel, I was about to call you. His hand tightened around the phone. What happened? Koda started pacing after you left. Then he wouldn't drink. I checked his gums and breathing, nothing obvious, but I'm not comfortable guessing. I want him seen by a veterinarian. Daniel looked at Elena. Her shift, her suitcase, his judgment, everything had just moved down the list. Take him to Oak Ridge Animal Clinic. I'll meet you there. Elena reached for the truck door. Drive. Daniel started the engine, and Marcy's next words came through the speaker before they pulled away. There's one problem. Koda won't get into my car. Daniel turned the truck around before they reached the next intersection, but by the time he pulled back into the driveway, Koda had made the decision for all of them. The German Shepherd stood just inside the garage beside Marcy, leash dragging loose across the concrete, his body angled away from her sedan. He was panting harder now, not dangerously, but enough that Daniel stopped 10 feet away instead of walking straight in. He tried to follow your truck, Marcy said. Then he froze at my car. Daniel looked at Koda's pause, posture, breathing, and eyes. Nothing told him why. That was the problem. Elena stepped out beside him, still carrying the pressure of the mist shift in the set of her mouth. Can he ride in yours? Daniel nodded too quickly. Usually. He opened the rear passenger door. Koda looked at it, then at Daniel, and backed deeper into the garage. Daniel felt the mistake before he made it, and made it anyway. Come on, buddy. He shortened the distance, reached for the leash, and tried to guide Koda forward with calm pressure. Koda planted his feet. Daniel held for 1 second too long. The shepherd twisted free, not violently, but with enough panic to send the leash skittering under the workbench. Koda retreated behind a stack of storage bins and refused to come out. Marcy's voice stayed level. Stop. Daniel did. His hand remained suspended in the air for a moment before he dropped it. The old habit had betrayed him again. Identify resistance, apply structure, keep moving. It worked on schedules. It worked on equipment. It did not work on a frightened dog. Worse, Koda had stopped looking at him. We lost ground, Daniel said. Marcy nodded. Yes. She did not soften it. Elena checked her phone. My manager just replaced me for today. Daniel turned toward her. I'm sorry. I know. She slid the phone into her pocket. Doesn't put the hours back. The costs settled across the garage in separate pieces. Elena had lost income. Koda had lost enough confidence to hide from Daniel. And the veterinary appointment Marcy had arranged was now 20 minutes away, with no safe way to transport him by force. Daniel called the clinic and explained only what was happening. The receptionist moved the appointment and advised them not to escalate the dog's stress, while Marcy monitored him for any worsening signs. It was practical, responsible, and still felt like failure. Daniel sat on the concrete outside Koda's hiding place without reaching in. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Koda shifted once, but did not emerge. Elena lowered herself onto the overturned bucket across from Daniel. So what now? Now I stop pretending urgency makes me right. He looked toward the truck, then the suitcase still visible through the rear window. And before I ask Koda to go anywhere again, I'm giving you back control of your property. He stood and made the decision that would carry them into the next hour. We deal with the suitcase first, on your terms, and then we figure out how to help him without cornering him again. Daniel opened the truck's rear door and stepped away. Your bag, your call. Elena watched him for a second, then nodded toward the driveway. Bring it out, set it down, and don't touch the zipper. Daniel did exactly that, carrying the suitcase by the side handle this time so the weight would not swing. Koda remained behind the storage bins until the suitcase touched the concrete. Then his ears appeared first, followed by his head. He did not approach. Daniel sat 10 feet away, turning his body slightly so he was not facing Koda directly. Elena crouched beside the suitcase and rested one palm on top. I'm opening it. Daniel nodded. I won't interfere. She pulled the zipper slowly. Koda rose, but stayed where he was. Inside were folded clothes, a pair of work shoes, toiletries in a clear plastic pouch, and a cast-iron skillet wrapped in a dish towel. Nothing looked remarkable. Elena lifted the skillet out and set it on the concrete. Koda flinched at the dull scrape of iron against cement and immediately backed 2 steps. Daniel saw the connection. Sound and movement mattered. But then Koda stopped. His nose lifted toward the open suitcase, and instead of retreating farther, he looked at Daniel. Daniel did not call him. He tapped the floor once beside his own boot, an invitation rather than a command. Koda hesitated, crossed half the distance, then stopped again. Daniel waited. After several seconds, Koda chose the remaining steps and stood beside him. That was different from obedience. He had been given room to refuse. Elena watched them both. What now? You keep going if you want. She removed the shoes, the toiletry pouch, 2 rolled shirts, and a canvas document envelope. At the bottom lay an old wool blanket, compressed flat beneath everything else. Koda's breathing changed before Daniel could decide whether that mattered. He lowered his head, sniffed once from several feet away, then leaned his shoulder against Daniel's leg without moving closer. Daniel placed one hand lightly against Koda's ribs. We stop if he backs off. Elena nodded. Together, without touching the dog or forcing the bag toward him, they moved the suitcase 6 feet farther from the garage entrance. Koda stayed beside Daniel. Conditional cooperation, fragile but real. Elena lifted the blanket. Beneath it was nothing dramatic, only a second cloth layer and a faint dark stain along the suitcase lining. She stared at it. That wasn't there when I packed. Daniel did not answer. A stain could mean spilled coffee, damp fabric, rust, a dozen harmless things. But it was the last unexplained physical detail left to see before anyone started making claims. Elena reached toward it, then stopped herself. We need someone who knows what they're looking at. Daniel nodded. Yes. Koda suddenly stepped away from Daniel, circled once, and chose to lie between him and Elena rather than behind either of them. The relationship had changed. So had the problem. Elena picked up the document envelope, turned it over, and frowned at a name written across the back that Daniel had not seen before. Elena turned the envelope over again, and the color left her face. That's my mother's name. Daniel stayed where he was beside Koda. He did not ask to see inside. Elena had spent the last hour losing control of her schedule, her property, and other people's assumptions. He was done adding to the pile. You packed this after she died? He asked. Elena shook her head. I didn't pack it. That changed the room. She sat on the overturned bucket and held the envelope across both palms. Her mother, Elena Ruiz, had died 11 months earlier after a long illness. Elena explained that the suitcase had been handed to her by the assisted living facility when she cleared the last of Lydia's belongings. Elena had opened the top layer once, seen familiar clothes in the skillet, and never dug farther. She had assumed everything inside had been her mother's. Daniel glanced at the wool blanket, then at the dark mark in the lining. The assumption that Elena knew every object in the bag was gone. So was his earlier suspicion that her reaction meant she had been hiding something. Her anger had come from being questioned about the last container of possessions she had left from someone she loved. Koda shifted beside him. The shepherd did not approach the suitcase, but when Elena's breathing grew uneven, he stood, crossed the narrow space, and stopped near her knee. He waited. Elena looked down at him. "You're confusing everybody today." Koda lowered his head. She offered an open hand. He sniffed it, then stayed. Daniel felt his own chest tighten at the simplicity of it. The dog who had refused her luggage was choosing her company. Elena opened the envelope herself. Inside were ordinary papers, facility receipts, a medication list, and an inventory sheet from the day Lydia's room had been cleared. Daniel read only when Elena handed it to him. The list included clothing, toiletries, 1 cast-iron skillet, and 1 canvas suitcase. No wool blanket. Elena looked back at the open case. So that blanket wasn't hers. It was not proof of wrongdoing. Staff could have packed a facility blanket by mistake. Laundry got mixed. Rooms were cleared quickly. Daniel said exactly that. Elena nodded, but her mouth had gone tight. Then I want to know whose it was before I carry it another mile. The choice ahead was no longer about satisfying Koda's reaction. It was about whether Elena was willing to reopen a painful part of her mother's last year, and whether Daniel would stand beside her without taking over. He called Oak Ridge and rescheduled Koda for later that afternoon, then offered Elena his truck for the trip to the assisted living facility. She looked at Koda. "He comes too, if the vet says the ride is okay." Daniel understood what she was asking. Not protection, not investigation, but partnership. Then his phone rang, and Marcy's name appeared on the screen. When he answered, she skipped hello. "Daniel, don't bring Koda here yet," she said. "The clinic pulled his old records, and there's something you need to hear before you decide where he goes next." Marcy's voice stayed calm on the speaker. The clinic found a note from Koda's previous placement evaluation. He has a documented stress response to certain institutional laundry odors and metal on concrete noise. Not aggression. Avoidance, pacing, refusal to load into vehicles after exposure. Daniel looked at the cast-iron skillet beside the open suitcase, then at the wool blanket lying across the garage floor. 2 details he had treated as separate now sat in the same line. The skillet scrape had startled Koda. The blanket had come from somewhere Elena did not recognize. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of his phone. "So he wasn't warning us about the suitcase." "Not in any reliable sense," Marcy said. "He may have been reacting to associations you couldn't see." Elena folded her arms. "And we built half a day around that reaction." Daniel did not defend himself. He had delayed her shift, handled Koda badly, and turned uncertainty into authority because action felt better than doubt. "That part's mine." Marcy hesitated. "There's more. Oak Ridge wants the rescue coordinator notified because Koda is still inside the 90-day placement review. If they think his stress is being mishandled, they can suspend the placement." The words landed quietly. Daniel looked at Koda, who had moved from the garage entrance to Elena's side. The shepherd leaned against her calf for a moment, then crossed to Daniel without being called and sat close enough that his shoulder touched Daniel's knee. No command. No leash pressure. His choice. Daniel closed his eyes once, opened them, and made the decision before fear could dress itself up as prudence. "Notify them." Elena turned. "Daniel, if I hide what happened because I want to keep him, then I'm making him pay for my mistake." Marcy exhaled. "They may remove him today. Tell them everything." 20 minutes later, the rescue coordinator called. Daniel answered every question without trimming the parts that made him look better. He admitted forcing the leash after Koda resisted. He admitted delaying veterinary care because he had focused too long on the suitcase. By the end of the call, the coordinator suspended Daniel's placement authority pending review. Koda could remain with him only until the scheduled veterinary examination that afternoon. After that, custody would transfer temporarily to the rescue's approved foster network. The loss was immediate, not theoretical. Daniel received the transfer notice by email while standing in his own garage. Elena read his face. "You lost him. For now. I lost the right to decide where he goes." Koda nudged Daniel's hand, then walked back to Elena and lay beside the unfamiliar blanket without touching it. Daniel crouched, not to restrain him, only to fasten the leash when Koda willingly stepped close. The path forward had narrowed to one responsible option. Get Koda evaluated, then use the suitcase inventory, the blanket, and Elena's own records to ask the assisted living facility what had happened without turning the dog into evidence. Daniel opened the truck door, and this time Koda climbed in on his own. The answer was ordinary, painful, and definitive. What had happened was a packing error during Lydia's room clearance 11 months earlier. Who was responsible was not a criminal or secret adversary, but the facility's own discharge team, which had combined Lydia's belongings with laundry and personal property from another room during a rush turnover. Why it happened was documented in the same workflow Elena's papers already pointed toward. Lydia's room had been cleared quickly after her death, and staff had used an unverified card of folded items while preparing the room for the next resident. How it happened became clear when the administrator matched the items already seated in Elena's suitcase against the written inventory. The cast iron skillet and clothing belonged to Lydia. The central question was finally closed. The suitcase had not concealed a crime, Koda had not uncovered a secret, and Elena had not lied about its contents. Daniel had misread a frightened dog and nearly turned uncertainty into accusation. Outside the facility, Elena folded the written acknowledgement once and slipped it into her purse. "You were wrong," she said. Daniel nodded. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "You stayed long enough to admit it." His phone buzzed before he could answer. The rescue coordinator was calling with the decision that would determine where Koda slept that night. Daniel answered the call on the second ring. The rescue coordinator did not make the decision sound dramatic. Koda's temporary transfer would stand through the end of the week, but the placement would not be terminated. The veterinary notes, Marcy's account, and Daniel's own admission showed a handling mistake, not neglect. If Daniel completed 2 supervised sessions with the rescue's behavior consultant and agreed to follow Koda's stress management plan, the placement could resume. "So he's not coming home tonight," Daniel said. "No," the coordinator replied. "But that doesn't mean he isn't coming back." The distinction mattered. Daniel thanked her, ended the call, and stood beside Elena under the dry late summer light while traffic moved along the county road beyond the facility. Elena did not tell him he deserved another chance. She did not tell him everything had worked out. She simply held out her truck keys. He looked at them. "You drove. You're the one whose dog just got temporary custody paperwork." Daniel took the keys. "Fair." Over the next week, consequences moved at ordinary speed. Elena returned to work, but the missed shift stayed missed. Her manager restored her regular schedule after she explained the emergency, and Daniel reimbursed her for the lost day only after she made him write "one-time transportation disaster" in the memo line so it would not feel like charity. The assisted living facility kept its property audit open under its normal review process, while the written acknowledgement remained Elena's immediate resolution. Nothing magically repaired the final year she had spent managing her mother's decline. Still, she stopped keeping the suitcase packed. She washed what belonged to her, stored the skillet in Daniel's garage temporarily, and donated 2 jackets she knew she would never wear. Daniel attended both supervised sessions. The behavior consultant corrected him more than once, especially when he anticipated Koda's movement and tightened the leash before the dog had actually resisted. Daniel learned to wait for information instead of manufacturing it. At the end of the second session, the coordinator returned Koda's placement authority with a 90-day follow-up rather than a clean slate. Daniel accepted that too. When Koda came back, there was no cinematic sprint across a parking lot. The shepherd climbed from the foster volunteer's SUV, sniffed the driveway, ignored Daniel for nearly half a minute, then walked to the garage and stopped where the suitcase had once sat. Daniel stayed several feet away. Koda turned, crossed the distance on his own, and pressed his shoulder against Daniel's knee. The same brief gesture he had offered days earlier, only now Daniel did not mistake it for permission to control what came next. He scratched once behind Koda's ear, then let his hand fall. Elena arrived carrying the cast-iron skillet. "My kitchen has room now," she said. Daniel opened the garage door for her. Koda followed at his own pace. Outside, warm evening lights stretched across the driveway, and the soft scrape of iron against the workbench made Koda pause, look back at Daniel, and then choose to stay.